The Financial Survival Network, helping you to survive and thrive in the new economy. Get your free financial survival toolkit and find out where to buy gold and silver safely at great prices. Sign up at financialsurvivalnetwork.com. This is the Financial Survival Network.
1490 WGCH. This is Kerry Lutz, and you're listening to the Financial Survival Network, which is brought to you by Miles Franklin. They've been in business selling gold since 1990, and I'm a customer because when you buy, they ship. To find out more, go to milesfranklin.com or call them at 800-822-8080 and get a free quote. We're wondering, are we in a recession or are we in a depression? The economists, if you listen to them, and the Ministry of Propaganda that the government calls economic statistics, they all say it's a recession. Others, like Ron Hera and myself, believe it's a major depression, as well as Doug Casey and many others. Hey, Ron, welcome back to FinancialSurvivalNetwork.com.
Hey, Kerry, thanks for having me on again.
Always a pleasure. So what is it, Ron? Recession or depression?
Oh, well, depending on which economy you're talking about, but for the United States, and I think it's glaringly obvious in places like Greece, for example, or in Spain, where you have 50% youth unemployment, that those economies are in depression. And in the United States, despite the news media, which really paints a rosy picture, and despite the economic statistics, which have been significantly modified from the way that the economic data used to be measured, I think we're definitely in a depression. And not only that, it's not the beginning of a depression per se, but it's much closer to the beginning than to the end.
So we're closer to the beginning, so we haven't even hit the seventh inning stretch yet, huh?
No, I mean, right now we're basically looking at what's probably going to be called a double dip. And, I believe there never was a recovery, and there's tons of data to support this, that, if you take out the government deficit spending, for example, from GDP, you find that GDP's been negative the whole time because there's been over $1 trillion, almost $1.5 trillion since 2008 of government deficit spending. So obviously the economy hasn't really grown. It's just being pumped up by government deficit spending, which is just adding to the federal debt. So GDP is not a real number. And then let's take the inflation number. It's clear that it's systematically understated, and I'll just give you one common sense argument that proves that point, that if the government deficit is $1.3 trillion and the federal debt is $16 trillion, then you're looking at maybe 8% inflation just from that government deficit spending. That's inflationary. So if that's the actual inflation rate, then, if that's the rate of inflation caused just by government spending, then obviously you can't have inflation be, 1% or 2%. That number's not accurate.
Yeah, I think everyone agrees that the books have been cooked. We haven't gotten the truth. You haven't gotten the truth for years and years. And that depression, which means that standard of living actually goes down for a prolonged period of time. In the Great Depression, it was years before they admitted that the country was in a depression. So why should this time be any different?
Yeah, I'd like to backtrack a little to the economic data and just talk about unemployment, because this whole point about, when your neighbor loses his job, it's a recession, and when you lose your job, it's a depression. Basically, the unemployment numbers, I don't think people realize how completely devastating unemployment is. Unemployment benefits don't allow people to necessarily keep their homes or service their debts or, hang on to anything they've financed, the purchase of cars, whatever. And the unemployment numbers are shocking. If you measure unemployment, if you looking at shadow stats, if you measure it the way it used to be measured, it's about 23% right now. And even the official U6 unemployment is about 16%. Those are huge numbers, and that has a massive effect, not just on consumer spending, but it completely wipes out families. This, prolonged unemployment wipes out generational wealth.
Yeah, well, it's a horrible thing, and so much of it is hidden from the average person's view. It's hidden from your view by design. You've got these EBT cards now, So somebody goes and buys stuff at a supermarket. You don't know if they're using a debit card, a credit card, or food stamps. So it's hidden from view. Whereas in the Great Depression, you had guys selling apples on the corner, you had bread lines, but now we have virtual bread lines.
That's right. There's no stigma attached to being dependent on the government. But I would point out that there's really more than one population that's been, insulated, so to speak, not just from the social stigma of, being dependent on the government, for example, but if you take the portion of the population that's been dependent on government benefits, welfare, food stamps, et cetera, and just, that population is still dependent on the government today if you compare like 2006 or 2007 with today. So they've actually been relatively unaffected by the economic decline in the United States. So there's a whole swath of the population, a significant percent, at least 15%, that is unaffected by the current economic climate. Similarly, if you have, let's say you had 23% unemployment, that leaves you with 77% of the workforce still employed. Now, a lot of those people might be making less money than before, but let's just say at least 50% of the workforce, those in industries that have remained strong, is relatively unaffected. And so therefore, those people go about their lives relatively unaware of what's happening in the economy.
Isn't that interesting? So they're not affected, and the government employees, the ones that still have jobs, because we know that finally they've reduced the numbers of those people. So, but most of them, 90-something%, still have jobs. The government retirees, they haven't been affected. So it's only the people in the private sector who have to work for a living, and a lot of business people who've really borne the brunt of this thing, right?
That's right, and that is the crux of the matter. So you have these, segments of the population that are insulated from the ongoing economic decline. And you mentioned retirees and government employees, and I mentioned welfare recipients and people who have remained employed for the duration. These people are relatively unaware and relatively unaffected. But what that means is that you have a great portion of the workforce that's actually been eliminated, 23% of it, and those people haven't found new jobs. I mean, that's a long-term unemployed problem, and particularly I think small businesses have been affected, and certain industries have been utterly devastated, not just construction, but let's say hospitality, for example, and whole industries that are in a structural decline. It's a long-term decline.
Yeah, and yet if you look at like healthcare, they've expanded somewhat, which is directly a beneficiary of government transfer payments, and you look at contractors that supply to the government, most of them have been pretty well off and unaffected. So the private economy has taken it on the chin.
I agree, and a lot of the growth is actually manufactured by inflation. So when you look at some of the data, like let's say retail sales or consumer credit, retail sales can be explained almost totally by inflation. And consumer credit is explained completely by the increase in student loans, people going back to school because they can't find a job. There's $1 trillion in student loans now. So, these problems are really not going away. They're getting worse, and the structural problems in the economy have not been worked out. The policies we have don't really address the root causes of the decline, and so the decline is definitely going to continue and deepen.
Well, you're just a bundle of joy, but you can actually make money off of this, right?
Well, you can try to protect your wealth if you have any, by insulating yourself from the consequences of inflation or the consequences of deflationary risk in terms of out in the real economy where small businesses are struggling, where loans are less available for consumers and small businesses. So money is more scarce in the real economy, which puts deflationary pressure on the economy where, in fact, there's an excess amount of debt. And so then you have policy-based inflation in the financial sector with the Federal Reserve and the government standing ready to do QE or to bail out banks and so forth. So you have, on the one hand, a risk of inflation, and on the other hand, deflationary pressures. So as an investor, I think, and I'm not a financial advisor, but I think the thing to do is to own hard assets free and clear outside the financial system, at least to guarantee or to secure a portion of your wealth that way. That's what I've done. And then in addition to that, I invest in companies that produce natural resources because I believe hard assets in the ground are a good value.
Makes a lot of sense. And people want to find out more and check out your newsletter. Where do they go?
HeraResearch.com. It's HERA research.com.
And you've had some like major hits, although the mining sector, natural resources, been a little depressed of late, but it looks like perhaps the correction in precious metals is over, and that can only be good news for the miners.
Well, Kerry, most people buy high and sell low, and it's amazing how low the trading volumes are in a situation where many companies are trading basically near the value of their cash. Forget about their assets. Some companies are actually trading for less than cash. So if I came up to you on the street and said, would you take this $1.50 for $1? You might say yes.
Yeah, I'd see they're worth more dead than alive, so many of these companies. It's rather remarkable, and there are real value stocks out there, not that we're pushing any particular one, but if you're interested in them, then you really need to go to HeraResearch.com, because Ron really gets under the hood, gets down and dirty, visits the mines, talks to the management, and really tries to give you a picture of what's going on there. And for that, Ron, we're grateful. We will talk to you soon. It's been too long. We won't let so much time go by next time.
Thanks for having me on.
All right. You be well.